So right, do it again.
Studio's up. It's hard to pick a favorite between this one and Do It To Me by Lionel Richie from 1992, but both are on the same or in different sides. Do It To Me is on the B side of that particular one. And you are now welcome to Lagos Talks. It's a Feel Good Friday. So, yes, we're feeling good. And that is My Destiny by Lionel Richie to usher us in to this conversation on the 7th of March, 2025. Lagos Talks is a part of Smooth Breakfast, and every weekday from 9 till 10, what we do here is talk about different things that Lagos is dealing with and also issues that we need to address. And because it's a Feel Good Friday, we're not exactly dialing things down, but we're bringing your awareness to something else that makes us as human. And so we need to talk about the topic of self-worth, self-doubt, self-acceptance, and so on. So that's what we're doing this Lagos Talks this Feel Good Friday on Smooth 98.1. My name is Oluwaseun Olusegun. You know, I'm not a psychologist, neither am I a psychiatrist. I'm not going to be doing this talking. I do have my special guests already joining me, and you can join us as well. The WhatsApp line to be a part of the conversation is 0809 444 0981. The handle on YouTube where we're currently streaming live, you can see my face and the face of my guest, is at Smooth 981 FM Lagos. At Smooth 981 FM Lagos. So, to discuss the topic of self worth and every other thing involved in that, I do have a licensed trauma focused psychologist, and he's the founder of PsychAid app. Please welcome with me Dr. Chris Abojei. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me, and it's always a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you for coming back here, even though now things have changed, but we're going to let it slide. All right, so let's get started with the topic of self-worth. And if somebody hears that phrase for the first time, or maybe we all hear it, what do you think should come to a person's mind? Now, not what they think. I'm saying what should come to a person's mind when they hear self-worth?
Oh, good. So self-worth, when a person hears that concept or phrase or word, it's a person's overall sense of value. It is how you perceive your value and your abilities generally. That's basically what self-worth is. In simple terms, it's basically how you value yourself, how much you value yourself. That's, yes, that's what it is.
So go on.
Yeah. A lot of our self-worth, determines how we interact with ourselves and how we interact with the world as well. It is our belief in what we can do, what we deserve, and this is regardless of our external achievements. Many people might have a lot of external achievements, but yet still don't, value themselves or don't believe that they deserve to be respected or that they deserve, um, you know, good things generally. So self-worth is a perception and it is usually internalized by the individual.
I was going to ask how very important it is for you to consider writing a book about it because you wrote a book about self-worth titled I'm Good Enough, right? So
Yes.
what prompted that?
So I think first for me was my own personal struggle, realizing that, I would say that I wouldn't consider myself an underachieved psychologist, but I've, quite achieved a few things in my life. But I got to a point where had a few experiences that brought me to start, doubting myself. And I think therapy for me then, I was seeing a therapist, but in addition to that, I decided to, it started out with writing out a workbook for myself to help me through my struggles. But the more I wrote, the more I felt, okay, you know what, I think this is worth sharing with other people. But I think one of the things that I've also seen in my experience of practice is that in my years of practice is that self-worth or the lack of self-worth is one concept that is at the root of many mental health concerns. Let's take depression, for example. There is a concept called the cognitive triad of depression. And what it simply explains is that anyone who has a negative perception of themselves um, and then has a negative perception of the future or of the world generally is likely going to have depression. So one of the ways you can predict a person who's going to be depressed at some point is if they have a negative perception of themselves, a negative perception of the future or of the world around them. And even when you look at anxiety as well, anxiety typically it's rooted in a person's perception or perception of potential threats, right? And most times we find out in mental health that people who don't value themselves, who don't see, any worth in themselves, tend to perceive that something bad would happen, right? Because they think, oh, I'm not capable. And if I cannot handle this, it's going to go sour. It's going to be catastrophic. And this you can find in many mental health concerns, right? So what I have found is that self-worth or the lack of self-worth is rooted in many mental health concerns. And this is why I've devoted, my time and, to try to address it, because I think if we can address it, we would be able to prevent a lot of mental health breakdowns, and of course, help promote positive mental well-being.
Is self-worth the same as self-esteem?
Well, to a large extent, we can say that they're synonyms, right? Because self-esteem also is how much you value yourself, right? I always say that self-esteem is how much you esteem yourself, and that's it. It's how much you respect yourself, how much you value yourself. So they're synonyms. And the reason why I would hesitate many times is that the concept of self-esteem, many times, from a clinical perspective, might not be the same thing as the concept of self-worth. I think self-esteem sometimes is overrated because many times people from a clinical perspective, when people present, they tend to um, narrow down and then generalize. So for example, they narrow down to one thing that they cannot do, and then they use that one thing to generalize what their esteem would look like. Say, for example, a person doesn't like their facial color, for example. And because they don't like that one thing, they then ignore all the other things that they are good at and all the other things they can do. But what that means is that it then determines how well they would esteem themselves, right? So it's a concept that, sometimes I don't really talk about. I would prefer to talk about self-worth, but in literal terms, they are synonyms, I would say.
All right, thank you very much. In case you're joining for the first time, you're listening to Lagos Talks right here on Smooth 98.1. And this morning on Lagos Talks, we are discussing the concept of self-worth. We have laid the foundation of it. And by we, I mean my guest, actually. And my guest is a licensed trauma psychologist. His name is Dr. Chris Abojei. You can join the conversation as you are getting educated. The WhatsApp line to send your messages to is 0809 444 0981. That's the WhatsApp line. And you can also join us on YouTube at Smooth 981 FM Lagos. We'll go on a short break and we'll be right back.
Smooth breakfast. Smooth breakfast. Smooth breakfast.
So when we come back, we talk about self-doubt.
Okay.
And other things involved in self-doubt, talking about the causes, what it is, the causes, how do you mitigate it and the likes. And then we move to self-acceptance and, the journey to discovering your self-worth and other things.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Anywhere. Now on showminds.com.
What we're going to do right now is take you way back into time. Way back. Timeless music.
Let's get it on with Motown greatest hits from as far back as the 70s.
Martin King Song. The Temptations. Gloria Gaynor. Gladys Knight. Gladys Sex. Enjoy the sweet collection and brand emotional greatest hits. Downtown Monday from 11 a.m.
Love music, love life. You are listening to Lagos Talks on Smooth 98.1. It's now 16 minutes past 9 o'clock, and we are talking about self-worth right here on Lagos Talks. My name is Oluwaseun. My guest is a licensed trauma psychologist. His name is Dr. Chris Abojei, and we are talking about self-worth. Join the conversation on WhatsApp 0809 444 0981. We're live on YouTube at Smooth 981 FM Lagos. Now, let's get into self-doubt. How do you define it?
Okay, so self-doubt is a feeling. It's also a perception as well, but it's a perception of inadequacy. It's a person perceiving themselves or as not being good enough, right? When a person or an individual has this uncertainty that they are not worth, not in much, they are not good enough. It leads to fear of failure for some people. They doubt their ability generally. So when you think about self-doubt, you want to look at it as the opposite of self-worth, or something that happens or results from a lack of self-worth, but it usually leads to the individual, doubting their ability. And of course, we talked about self-esteem the other time, esteeming themselves lower than they should generally. So many people with self-doubt tend to think, I'm not good enough, right? That's a simple way of just looking at it, is I'm not good enough.
When people say I'm not good enough, do they verbally say it, or what are some of those actions that portray a person's thought of I'm not good enough?
So for us, saying that I'm not good enough is what we will call a core belief, right? And this we would see in mental health and in therapy. We'd say that is a core belief. Now, a core belief is the way a person sees themselves. It's like a lens, the lens through which they see themselves and through which they see the world. They might not necessarily say it out, but it will reflect in the things that they do, right? It would reflect in how they carry themselves. For example, you would see some people who would never ask for what people think they deserve. For example, they would not ask for a raise. For example, they would not apply for opportunities that they probably should be applying for. These could be strongly linked to, that belief that they are not good enough. You ask them to take up something, an opportunity, and they will tell you 1,001 reasons why they might not be able to do this or to take up these opportunities. Again, this is strongly linked to feeling that they are not, good enough, or doubting themselves or doubting their ability. So most times it leads to people hesitating. It could even lead to a fear of failure. And I've also seen in some cases leading to some perfectionism as well. So you see people want to do the extra. They are not satisfied with doing anything because they're always thinking it's not good enough. It's not good enough. So they want the extra. They could also be very critical on themselves as well, and maybe even critical on other people because they are projecting their own insecurities. Most times when you see people with self-doubt, you're also seeing, and people who think they're not good enough, you're seeing a lot of insecurities as well. So you would probably hear it in the things that they say, right? They might not necessarily say, verbatim by saying, "Oh, I'm not good enough," but you will hear it in the negative, statements that they use to describe themselves, to describe, their chances, and to describe the future as well.
Well, expectedly, what are the things that cause self-doubts? Because, of course, we need to understand them.
I think one of the very core factor is a person's past experiences. And when we think about a person's past experiences, you cannot rule out the place of childhood experiences and parenting as well. Parenting is at the core of most of our experiences. Now, this is not to say that parenting is the only factor, but we have found that the kind of parenting a person has or experienced while growing up determines how much they perceive themselves. But beyond parenting, you also have environmental factors. So we've talked about parenting, but a person could have gone to schools or interacted with teachers who were always telling them that they're not good enough and all of that. So the people around you also, contribute significantly to determine that. We also find that traumatic experiences, trauma, and when I talk about trauma, I'm not necessarily talking about PTSD. I'm talking about significantly distressing life events. When people experience significantly distressing life events, it could also lead to them thinking, or being stuck, in those core beliefs. Because one of the things that trauma does is that trauma affects our sense of self. It affects our ability or our perception of being able to handle certain situations. Again, mostly because during trauma, a lot of things happen in our brain and a lot of things happen in our body. Our brain, our body gets into the survival mode. And at that point of survival, we are not rationally examining everything. We're not rationally examining the evidences around. And we are likely going to be focusing only on the negatives because, again, the brain needs to do that to help us escape whatever threat that we've been exposed to. So we find that people who have experienced trauma, significant traumatic experiences in their lives, people who have negative self-talk around them. There was a study that showed how you had a group of children who were studied over time, and one of the groups were always said, parents and people around them were always saying negative things to them. You're not good enough, you're terrible, you fail. And the other ones, positive things. And of course, the result is obvious. Those that, were being fed positive, affirmations and positive ended up doing a lot better. So past experiences, people around you, traumatic experiences, significant distressing life experiences go a long way to predict a person's sense of worth. I shared earlier about my own experiences, and I think one of that was culture shock for me, and having to start all over again and rebuild my career and all of that. Experiences like that can also affect your perception of self generally. So experiences generally, but most importantly, your childhood experiences play a significant role in determining how you perceive yourself.
Obviously, now I have to ask you the role of parents in helping to build the self-worth. And before I even go to that, is self-worth built or discovered?
That's tricky. So it's both, right? Both from one end. One end is that you cannot build what is already there, right? Or you shouldn't be building what is already there. But you can reinforce a perception, right? And so when we try to reinforce that perception, that knowledge, then we say, oh, you're building your self-worth. But from the different perspective where we're saying everyone is born good enough, right? And there are different, theories and professional perspectives to look at here. Take, for example, and this might sound like jargon, but the humanistic school of thought for us as psychologists believe that everyone is born with the potential to self-actualize. But they go on to say this, they go on to say that the problem that we experience is that as we go through life, we have these negative or difficult experiences that then affect our perception. So what you see from this school of thought is that it's not your self-worth that is affected. It is your perception of that self-worth that is affected. And I always use kids as an example. If you have a child, ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? They don't hesitate, right? They wouldn't start to say, I'm not sure I can even be this thing. They will dream, they will tell you, I want to be an astronaut. But as they grow older, and maybe if they are living in Nigeria and jam starts to jam them, they now need to rethink these things and say, are you sure I can become a psychologist or a medical doctor or an astronaut, whatever they had thought they wanted to be. So when we look at self-worth, it's not something you build, it's something that you become aware of, right? Because we all have that inherent self-worth. And you don't have to be taller, you don't have to be, fatter, you don't have to smile more. You don't have to be any of those things, do anything. You don't have to be richer to have a self-worth. It's there already. In fact, it is your consciousness of your self-worth that even goes on to help you achieve whatever you set your mind to achieve.
So is this where self-acceptance comes in, that you don't have to do more or be more?
Yes, exactly. This is actually where self-acceptance comes in, right? Because what self-acceptance really does is that it helps the person to acknowledge themselves, acknowledge their strengths, acknowledge their weaknesses as well. Because when we talk about self-worth, it doesn't really only say that you have a sense of value for yourself or your ability. So we're not only saying that, oh, you have value and there are no weaknesses. Oh, there are weaknesses. There could be weaknesses. And I talked about self-esteem earlier. The problem we have is that many times we then exaggerate the weaknesses over the strengths. So what self-acceptance really does is that it brings us to a place where we're able to acknowledge both. We're able to acknowledge our strengths. We're able to acknowledge our weaknesses. We're able to acknowledge our worth. We're able to acknowledge ourselves, but we're not doing it from a negative bias. We're not esteeming or exaggerating the negatives over the positives. We are acknowledging, we are accepting that, oh yes, this is what it is, but we're also able to use the strengths and then to achieve whatever we want to achieve. We're able to focus more on the strengths over the weaknesses.
I so much like how you picked into my mind, and it's about the strength you mentioned. So, in an individual's bid to know themselves and to do the SWOT analysis of themselves, remember that we're dealing with beliefs here, perception, and your mindset.
Mhm.
How do you make sure that you are accurate in your estimation of yourself? And this is what I mean. So you
Mhm.
decide to analyze yourself. This is my strength, and this is
Mhm.
my weakness. How do
Mhm.
you make sure that you don't write or pronounce your strength as your weakness and your weakness as your strength?
So, I think the first thing that we need to look at is most times when people try to do that, they're doing it from a place of, it's usually not from a place of, self-worth, right? It's from a place of doubt where they're saying, okay, I'm not even sure I'm good enough. So let me even see what my strengths are and all of that. I always would say, hey, why don't we start from a place where we say to ourselves, oh, I'm good enough, right? I'm good enough regardless of what I discover. But one of the other things that you get to do is when you do a lot of introspection, for example, when you're able to consciously analyze situations or experiences that you've had and areas where you have done very well, where you have showcased some abilities, right? I'll give an example. I do a lot of neurocognitive assessments, and we do that with kids as well. When they do some of this neurocognitive assessments, we could find out a child who comes out to have a very good working memory, for example, but they have a very poor processing speed. Now that means that this child will take time to process information, but they will be able to memorize things very fast, right?
Mm.
Now, but this child in class or in school might struggle. They might struggle because they are taking time to process things while others are already done processing and moving forward. So they require more time to process information than the average child. Now, if they're not aware of this, because of this one weakness, they might begin to see themselves negatively, and I'm speaking about this specifically because I also have a slow processing speed. And I remember
Mm.
meeting my spouse, and when she's done talking and she wants me to respond fast, I'm saying, you know what, I'm still
Give me
processing.
time.
And at some point she'll just joke about it. And when she's done talking and she says, okay, what do you have to say? I'm like, she said, oh, you are still processing it, Abby. I say, yes, I'm still processing it. But there are kids like that, right? Having a slow processing speed doesn't mean that you are a poor learner, right? It just means that you need more time. So what I see here is that, but there are other areas that you must have noticed that you're good at, you're very good at. For example, I see some of these kids are very good with, memorizing things, for example. That's a strength. You would have noticed some of those things. The problem is that you have focused more on the weaknesses that you've not had time to really look at and see the strengths. So what I always would say to people is, why don't we start first by looking at your past experiences, looking at those areas where you've done pretty better than where you're struggling. Maybe those could be your areas of strength, and maybe we can focus on those areas and then use them to our advantage.
All right, thank you for your explanation. I'll go to WhatsApp to take this message, and know that you can also send your message on WhatsApp. You can drop it on YouTube as well. The WhatsApp line is 0809 444 0981. 0809 444 0981. Braithwaite from Ekpetedo says, good morning, Smooth. Self-worth, self-dignity, and want of acceptance is a primary right of every human being. Reproach, rejection, and ostracization from society in biblical days was only limited to leprosy carriers. Today, however, people generally tend to be snobbish, and acceptance is based and prioritized by how deep your pocket is and what kind of connections you're able to generate. We delight in judging people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. Draconian behavior is pretty rampant everywhere, and people like the current man in the American White House have reactionary attitudes, which accumulate as a result of paranoia, pride, and possessing a complex. The ironical aspect of the stigmatization is that we psychologically take our wantiness out on other people just to cover up our complacent inadequacies. Wow. All right. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so that's a lot, but it does cover a lot of what we're talking about. I think the only part that I would like to speak on is when we look at self-doubt. I think, yes, society has, shaped a number of things such that we then, are judged by how, fat our wallets are and all of that. But I need to emphasize that when we talk about self-acceptance, when we talk about self-worth, the key word in all of these things beyond is the self. And that means that, the fact that you accept yourself means that it doesn't really matter what anybody else says or what anybody else thinks, right, about you. And don't get me wrong, societal perception is important, but it's important to the extent to which you are able to use it. So many of us allow the society to determine how good we are, and how, what we're able to do or what we cannot do. But that's where the problem is. The problem is that we are allowing society to determine our worth. But like I said earlier, your self-worth has nothing to do with the society. It is inherent. It is what you're born with. And what really matters is, if we keep on giving the society a louder voice, what happens is that we're no longer looking inward. We're no longer looking at ourselves. We're now looking at them. And if we keep on looking at the society, it means that our self-worth will be based on what the society says it is. And we see a lot of that with Black people, Africans, is we allow what the Western world says determine, how good we are, how we perceive ourselves. We allow what, our friends say, what the social media, and that's not how it should be. And that's one of the things I'm trying to address with the book, I'm Good Enough, is to get us to a point where we recognize that what really matters first and what is most important is how you perceive yourself. Now, the good thing about this is that the society would get to listen at some point, right? The society will get to listen. And we've seen a number of cases like that. We've seen cases with people who were told that they were not good enough, but they went on to do what they thought they were good at. And eventually the society listened. If I told you that someone like, how about Einstein, for example, at some point was told that he couldn't learn, and years later, even to today, we consider him as one of the brightest minds that the world has ever seen. The world will tell you things because they don't understand you. It's dependent on how well you're able to take that information and juxtapose that with your inherent worth, because that's what it matters most.
I have a question for you as a psychologist, amongst other questions I have, and that stems from what you have explained about the keyword here is self. And so every other person does not really matter. Now, we know we do not exist in isolation. We have people. family,
Mhm.
friends, mentors, subordinates, and the likes.
Mhm.
So, was a place of being, for the lack of a better word, regulated by others. And, so that others, others sometimes are seeing you and they're trying to help you regulate and, help to dull, no, I wouldn't say dull now, but your boundaries and helping you to regulate. That's just the word. I'll stick with that one. And the other one is, as a psychologist, what's your take on tough love?
So, and I think that the reason why you are struggling to use the word is because there's something wrong with that somewhere, right? And I saw that somehow you use the word dull and you then use the word boundaries. The question would be, why does somebody have to put boundaries on what you can and cannot do, right? Why does the society have to put boundaries on what you can and cannot do? Now, this for me, when I talk about self-worth, self-acceptance, I am not necessarily speaking from a place of norms and societal norms, right? Now, where the society really comes in is in establishing societal norms. But we also need to recognize, and I see that in many of the arguments that we even have, arguments about feminism and all of that, is that societal norms are designed to help guide people to promote their well-being, right? And but the problem we face is that we get to a point where we then consider these norms as laws, even though they no longer promote the well-being of the individuals that they are expected to promote, right? And this is where you then need to take charge. Society would put rules in place, and they're putting these rules in place not because the intention is to hurt you. Now, these rules might hurt us, but the intention wasn't to hurt us. The intention was to promote the well-being of the society. But at any point you recognize that these norms are not promoting your well-being, it is now your responsibility to look at it and see how you adjust it. And I say to people that the laws, the norms, the expectations of the society were made for you and not you for them. And this is something that we need to take note of. You were not made for the laws and the rules. The rules and the norms, laws and the norms were made for you. They're expected to promote your well-being. So society does have an influence in checking sanity and checking what is rational, right? And I did say that earlier, that there's a place of your loved ones telling you, oh, I don't think this is right, or I think this is a wrong step, or I think you're exaggerating your potential here, or I think you want to take a break. All of those things are valuable, but it still should come down to you to take that information and do a proper assessment based on facts, right? Based on, not from a place of fear, not from a place of doubt, but from a place of, what, I have this value, you know, what are they saying, and can I consider what they're saying rooted in rationality? Some people will project their own fears. Some people will project their own trauma, their own negative experiences. It doesn't make it true. It
Hmm.
doesn't make it true. You need to be able to take whatever they say to you and then, of course, do your own assessment. And then when we talk about the place of tough love,
Tough love.
um, tough love for me, sometimes I don't understand that concept, but I think what I think people try to mean when they say tough love is sometimes you need to be firm with certain people, even though you love them. I still think that's love. I don't when we put the word tough, it's because we think that love has to be soft. And so, because love has to be soft, whenever it's no longer soft, then we now need to put something to help us understand this kind of love that is different from love. Doesn't always have to be cozy and soft and all of those things. Love is simply two things. Love is the decision that we make towards, again, whoever we are loving, that prioritizes them and the feeling that we could have towards them. That is what love is. So if, for example, a person says, A says, I love B, the question you should be asking, does A make decisions that prioritize the well-being of B? And based on this, can A say that I have a positive feeling towards B. And I always say to people that when you have to choose between the positive feeling and the decisions should always come first. So by trying to prioritize a person's well-being, I might do some things that are not conventional. That is not, and so people will call that tough love, right? But that is still me prioritizing their well-being, right? And even in therapy, we have sometimes people come to therapy and definitely the way therapy is designed is that it gives people the opportunity to express themselves without judgment. But there are some times where you then need to be firm with some clients because you realize, oh, this is what they need. You need to be firm with them. You need to give, rules and say, this is what is expected of you for them to be able to make progress. Somebody sees that and they would say, oh, that's tough love. I would say that's love. It's,
It's not
we don't
tough.
put names behind them. Yeah.
Thank you. You're listening to Lagos Talks right here on Smooth 98.1, and we are talking about self-worth. Evidently, we have branched into other things, and I hope that you're getting clarity. Peradventure, you have a question on your mind? WhatsApp line to send your messages to is 0809 444 0981. Again, 0809 444 0981. And you can contribute or still ask that question by dialing 0201 448 9981. My guest is a licensed trauma psychologist, and just stay with us because we'll be right back after this. Ooh-wee. So after the breather, we come back to that one about parents and the role they play on the self-doubt or self-worth of children. And then we talk about how you can salvage your self-worth or maybe rebuild it.
Salvage. How you can, reconnect with it, I think, or become more conscious. Okay.
Whatever words that is appropriate.
So position on doing business in a thriving economy from the investor's perspective.
Quality product, it will be accepted.
Turn ideas into reality. Discover market opportunities. Stay innovative and stay ahead of the pack. Looking to your door with the best premium tips and information from the experts. All the business that just right. Tune in to Business Hub for everything business every Tuesday on the Smooth Drive at 5:15 p.m. This is Smooth Breakfast on your dial, just the way you like it.
Love music, love life. It's now 43 minutes past 9 o'clock. You're still listening to Lagos Talks. My name is Oluwaseun. I have as my guest a licensed trauma psychologist, and that is Dr. Chris Abojei, who's joining us virtually, and you can see him on YouTube at Smooth 920 FM. We're talking about self-worth, self-doubt, self-acceptance, and everything that has, well, self at the middle of it. And let's talk about the role that parents play in shaping the self-worth of children.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would say first that parents are the first anchor that children have, and so they are the first models. One of the ways that we learn, especially growing up, is we learn by modeling or what we call observational learning. So that's why you also find that there are a number of behaviors that the parents might even be speaking against them, but the child or the person still grows up having those behaviors, and you're wondering, and people would say, oh, it's, genetics, or some people even to the extent that this happens might even think it is generational causes. But these things are probably not generational causes. They are simply modeling, right? You have just modeled these behaviors, and almost every behavior can be modeled or can be observed and learned from observations. Even finances, the way you manage your finance, the way you carry yourself, the way you esteem yourself, all of these things can be learned by just observing. So parents actually create that foundational model that children can grow up, observing. So if you have parents that are timid or who don't perceive themselves positively, it's going to play out in the kind of relationships that those parents have. And these kids will observe those relationships and they will grow up responding that way as well. We see that as well. Again, when you think about people from different climes, you find out that people have been talking about how Africans can be more timid than the western part of the world, apart from Nigerians, right? They would say that, oh, Nigerians have a different spirit. So even though Nigerians within Nigeria can seem timid, when we go out of Nigeria, it almost looks like these guys are wild. And it still comes down to modeling. It still comes down to there's that thing that we say is the Nigerian spirit. It's modeling, it's not a spirit. There's nothing possessing us. It's just simply that we've observed these behaviors over time. And we have this tendency to not want to back down or give up and always want to chase our dreams and all of that. So modeling is one of the things. I also would say that, the relationships that the parents have with the child also goes a long way. The kind of parenting as well. So there are different types of parenting. You have the authoritative, authoritarian. You have the passive. You have the neglective parents as well. All of these things go a long way to determine, how the child grows up and how they perceive themselves. We have found out that the authoritative parenting is the best, and this is the kind of parenting that mixes, so like we say, the love, there are rules, and yes, there's also correction as well. So it's a mix of both. The parents can correct you, but they also show you that they love you and they care about you. Unlike some people that grew up in families where the parents are always trying to be strict, trying to be hard without any form of a loving relationship, it's not going to end up well as well, because that child is likely going to grow up, not feeling good enough. And then we talk about the negative, talks that we hear from our parents, telling them our comparison as well. That's also a very important thing to look at. Your parents are always saying, look at your cousins, look at your sister, look at this person, look at these people on TV. And do they have two heads? What that does is that they're comparing you with a lot of yardstick, and they're telling you indirectly, you're not as good as this. Now, I understand, and I always try to say this, in defense of parents, that many parents don't necessarily have the skills for parenting. The fact that you have a child doesn't mean you have the skills to parent. And this is a hard truth, um, because you want to become a doctor, you probably go to school for 6, 7 years to train. You want to become a parent, nobody really thinks about, oh, I need to go to school to do this. So we just have, and then we want to do it. We try to parent by trial and error. So you see that, and I always say, and some parents will even argue that, say, but I have 4 children. These two turned out well. Is it not the same parent? And I'll say to them, no, it's not the same parent. You're not the same parent for all your kids. The first child, you're a different parent. The second child, you're a different parent. The third child, you're a different parent. And you see that obviously. Some firstborns, for example, would speak about how their parents were very hard on them. But when they now look at how their parents are treating the lastborns, they are wondering, is it the same person that raised them? Now, this tells us that parenting differs per child. And this goes a long way to determine how this child will turn out. And I think very importantly also is how much protection the child gets from the parents as well, right? The child, you need to be the safe haven for your child. So the child fails at school, they need to go back home and realize that mommy and daddy would have my back, right? And this is not to say that you're going to tell them, oh, don't worry, keep on failing. That's not what we're saying. Because many parents say, so are you saying I should just be? No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that you want to be able to provide encouragement and validation. Why? If you remember when I talked about the humanistic school of thought, and I said how when we do have this potential for actualization, but when we start to fail, when we start to have these experiences in life, we begin to doubt ourselves. Now, your parents play a significant role in how that would translate, what that would translate to. So get back home and they tell you things like, you know what? We recognize that you didn't do your best here. We recognize that we still need to maybe learn a few things. We need to look at how to improve, but you can improve on this, right? It was Henry Ford that said this. He said, those who believe that they can and those who believe that they can't are both right.
Yep.
So your parents create that foundation to reinforce your can or your can't. The world, the experiences you have would make you think, and that's why they say the world is not a fair place, but the world, the
Mm.
experiences you have would make you think that you can't. But you need to be able to go back home and your parents are able to say, we recognize what you're seeing, we recognize that you need to improve here and there, but you can. And that is what eventually will determine yourself, your worth, right? Your self-worth. And I think finally, I'll talk about the place of traumatic experiences. Parenting also goes a long way to determine how chaotic our families are and our backgrounds are. Most people that have had to deal with complex trauma, PTSD, and all of those things, and poor perception of self, we can always trace back to what happened while growing up. What kind of family dynamics did they have? And that is the role of the parents. It's the parents that determine the family dynamics. So if mommy and daddy are always fighting, if mom and daddy are always using abusive words on themselves, again, that goes a long way to shape the mindset of the child. If, depending on the gender again, if mommy is always, raining curses and telling daddy how he's not good enough and all of that, it goes a long way to tell what the male child would also, perceive when they grow up, right? It goes a long way also to tell the female child, because you might think that, oh, since it's the male that is getting the negative feedback, that means it's the male child that will be affected. No, but the female child also, because unknowing to mommy, she's telling the girl child that, hey, your dad is not good enough, but I chose him, which means that when it's time for you to choose, you should choose somebody that is not good enough.
Hmm.
Right? It's might not make sense to a lot of people, but this is why you find out that a lot of people would say, oh, I don't like the kind of person my mom was, or I don't like the kind of person my dad was, but they end up marrying someone exactly the same. Right? So the place of modeling, the place of parenting, the place of validation and encouragement, the place, and this is something else that, I need to also talk about, the place of responsibility and providing opportunities. We live in a world today, and this is why you find out that mental health concerns are increasing. We live in a world today where parents think it is a badge of honor to do everything for their children. And they would always explain and say the reason is because they didn't have it when they were growing up. So what you find out is that we have a lot of kids that don't have parents, even though their parents are alive, even though their parents are providing, because they're probably raised by the nannies and all of that. Parents need to come to understand that the most important thing is not the money, it's not the expensive schools. Kids probably don't even remember all of these things. The most important thing is the relationships. And part of the relationship is the responsibility. How well are you able to train your kids to respond? How well are you able to train them to cultivate the ability to respond? So you don't have to do things for them. One of the things that I still remember about my dad is that there was a time when, he changed my school, and, he made me go to school by myself, right? So, and it didn't make sense because I thought you could just drop me off, right? Why? At that point, I thought I wasn't loved. I'm like, what did I do? But years later, I realized how that simple action of taking responsibility of my going to school and coming back made a significant difference in how well I was able to navigate life and take responsibilities. Things like that are the things that our parents had that they are depriving us or depriving the children of these days from, right? Our child complains, and the first thing you want to do is to jump in and try to, take away no, they need to learn how to deal with those things themselves. Now you can encourage them, you can let them know that they can deal with it, you can tell them how to, but let them take this responsibility, let them be accountable for a lot of things, whether mistakes, setbacks, successes, let them be responsible for it. And then, of course, do not be shy with celebrating your kids, right? Every opportunity you get, celebrate them. Celebrate the process more than you celebrate the outcome. Again, many parents celebrate the outcome. So you have A's, they celebrate you. You don't have A's, they're not celebrating you because they think, oh, you didn't have A's. But what if they're able to look beyond the A's and look at the effort that you put in? That is what we need to celebrate. It's the effort, the process. Because by celebrating the effort, you are reinforcing to that child that what matters is the effort. And the truth is, the more effort you put in, it begins to translate to outcomes at some point, right? So again, I've said a lot,
I
but
mean, there is so much that needs
parenting,
to be said.
yeah, parenting plays a significant role in how much we value ourselves.
Wow. Guess what? It's almost 1 hour and we're out of time. Well, Wilson says, I'm making complete sense of what the guest is saying, enjoying the conversation. Now, he had a question earlier. Unfortunately, we cannot take it, but I hope that you have been able to pick out bits and pieces of the answer, Wilson. I'm so sorry I saw that message late. Then Oluwaseun said, I saw a Twitter thread yesterday where parents tell people not to say no to their kids. They say it's negative and doesn't help their children. The world has gone to help. You know, I think about how these days people say we now have emotionally fragile children. We now have sensitive children. And in my mind, I always just hold myself back. And you remember the line that said, if you have nothing good to say, don't say nothing at all. Because I'm thinking, how did we get to the point of emotionally fragile children? They were raised or they were left. They didn't drop from heaven or from somewhere. Either you raise a child or you leave them, but one way or the other, they are raised. But what raised them, that is a conversation for another day. And we need to have you back because we're out of time. We need to have you back again because we have so much to talk about, still on the topic of self-worth. And we need to talk about why you decided to write an entire book on my catharsis, on the insanity in sanity. So we need to have a second part of this conversation. But thank you so much for sharing. And I believe you put all of this in your book, I Am Good Enough.
Yes, yes.
So how do we find it?
Well, so I'm Good Enough is on Amazon. You can just search for I'm Good Enough, Finding Freedom Through Self-Acceptance by Chris Abojei. It's on Amazon. You can also get copies from bookstores in Nigeria, Roving Heights, Booksellers, NG, Purple Bloom publishers as well. And this you can find in Abuja, in Port Harcourt, in Ibadan, I think, and Lagos as well. Or you can send a DM at Chris Abojei, and we'll find a way to get a copy to you. But yes, this is a work that I have actually put my experience, personal experience, struggles as well, and I'm hoping that people can benefit from the value of knowing that they're good enough and accepting themselves as well.
Thank you so much for this knowledge you've shared with us. And two key things. Number one is that you are good enough. And trust me, it's not even trying to butter you up. You are good enough. That you believe it is another ball game, but you need to believe it. And the second thing, which is a nugget from the conversation today by Chris Abojei, is that you have children does not make you a parent. You need to learn. Everything needs to be learned. So please learn and acquire knowledge in every ramification. Like I mentioned, we're going to have a second part of this conversation. We'll let you know when that will be. Thank you, Lagos. Thank you, Nigeria. Thank you, world, for being a part of this Lagos Talks for the 7th of March, 2025. And I must say, thank you, Smooth Breakfast family, for welcoming me and allowing me to be a part of your mornings. Of course, next week, Ayokumi will be back with you right here on Smooth 98.1. Now, 11 o'clock, Film Focus family, we are on. My name is Oluwaseun Olusegun.
Know you're listening in on this frequency.
We need to have part 2 and part 3. Because
I'm happy to come around. Yeah.
that last part you mentioned, we were just talking about it yesterday. And what were we talking about? The Lagos states announced that flogging has remained banned and it remains banned. So we were talking generally about disciplinary measures and what qualifies as discipline and the likes. And, some of these things contribute. So we mentioned it. So some of the callers mentioned that back then in the days that people were flogged and people were disciplined and they turned out well. And another caller said, no, some of the people you said were flogged are the ones in offices. They are the corrupt leaders. They did not turn out well. So flogging has got nothing to do on discipline. I mean, all these things. But one of the key things that was mentioned is that the quality of children, the quality of values and mentalities we have these days has definitely changed. And I kept wondering if you have agreed that you have changed, who are the people in charge? Who do we hold responsible? Where you say, don't touch my child, don't
The parents, and I always say that this is nothing against parents, right? One of the things that I wrote in this book, and the dedication was to my kids, but I did emphasize in the dedication to them that, see, I could do something wrong, and that parents have the best intentions, right? And that's something we need to note. So this is not to undervalue the efforts that parents put in. They usually have the best intentions. So when a parent says, I want to work hard for my kids so that they don't fail, it's from a positive place. The problem with that is that you can have the best intentions but not have the best approach, right? Because we think that the way to show your kids that you love them is if they don't suffer. But we fail to recognize that going through difficult, hard periods in life actually helps us build resilience. It is a core aspect of humanity. And they say that when you take away that opportunity to build resilience, you're actually building weaker people. And that's the problem that we have. Most kids now get their emotional support from social media. Unfortunately, social media is not real because you have a lot of people who are fragile, projecting their fragile sense of self-worth. And when I say projecting, that means they're not going to come out and say, I'm not good enough. They would say, you are not good enough. So that's why when you talked about society and the role of society, I said, hey, you need to take it with a pinch of salt, because somebody might be telling you you're not good enough doesn't mean you're not good enough. It's because they are projecting there. So parenting is a very, very important. And when I say parenting, I think I should be saying the family, because again, the problem we're also having is that our families have become individual focused compared to those days. Those days, it was okay for the community to raise the child. So even though the parents were not around, you had grandparents, you had uncles, you had aunties that could still instill those. In fact, the parents would confidently know that there are people at home who's going to raise you. But these days, we have shielded ourselves from the community, but we're not even doing a good job raising the kids. So, I think it's in the Chinese and Japanese culture. They believe that when you grow older,
yeah.
exactly, the role of grandparents is to go back and start to instill that knowledge on the kids, right? We don't have that because most of us are living in fenced, gated houses, gated
Which didn't used to be.
Yeah,
It was not like that before. And that's one of the things that makes me sad when I think about the Japa way.
Mhm.
I have my sister calling me, telling me that anytime that I speak to my niece, she tells me, you can't be speaking English to my child again. I'm already trying enough. So speak Yoruba to her. And the way they're always excited whenever they have a social gathering that involves other Black people and other Nigerians. So we no longer have that communal thing that, people would always watch out and look out. We don't have that anymore. So that's one of the greatest disservice that Japa has done to us.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And you threw a very brief jab on the leaders at some point, right? And I think we can blame them for everything, right? Nigeria is a beautiful place, and I realize how we have so much that we don't value. And most people who are jackpine are just looking for predictability. They want to be able to predict a number of things for themselves, right? That is what, governance is supposed to do for us. Governance is not supposed to solve all the problems. Governance is supposed to create some level of predictability. I know that I could, leave the house and, go somewhere. I know that the cost of certain things would remain a certain way. I'm not going to wake up one morning and realize that I can't find fuel to buy. All of those things are the problems that we have. And that's why people are really jackpotting, because the truth is, many of us many people can actually make almost the same amount of money they're making in Nigeria. But it's the predictability. I spent a lot of years in school because of, strike and all of those things. Many of us don't want our kids to do that, right? To experience all of those things. But again, what can we do? We just have to be intentional about, like I think your sister is doing. She's just being intentional, and that's good. Where she wants you to speak Yoruba and all of those things. That's intentional, and I think that's commendable.
Well, we'll take what we can get.
Yep.
Thank you so
for having
much.
me.
Like I mentioned,
really
I'll reach
appreciate it.
out for us to have another of this. It could be on this show or another show, but I'll definitely reach out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Have a good morning, or you go back to sleep.
Would you? Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not going back to sleep. I have a few things to do. I was gonna